I was staying at a rental cabin up in the Mogollon Rim area, past Woods Canyon Lake. This wasn't a fancy place. It was an old hunter's cabin, set back about half a mile from the nearest gravel road. Just me, a stack of books, and the silence. It was my second night there. Around midnight, I was dead asleep. I woke up suddenly, bolt upright, and I didn't know why. The cabin was pitch black, and the air was ice cold. I laid there, listening, and that's when I heard it. It wasn't a sound you hear often, if ever. It was a guttural, deep breath being taken right outside the thin wooden wall next to my head. Not a normal breath. This was a huge, ragged, sucking noise, like a giant clearing its throat after a long run. The sound seemed to fill the entire bedroom. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and kept listening. Then came the movement. Slow, heavy steps on the pine needles right outside the cabin. They weren't quick. They were measured, deliberate. Thump. Drag. Drag. Whatever it was didn't walk heel to toe. It sounded like a massive barefoot weight being lifted and then dropped down, then maybe a slide or a shift of weight before the next step. It circled the cabin. I could track it perfectly by the sound of those steps on the dry ground. It moved from the side wall, round the back, paused briefly near the kitchen window, and then came around to the front porch. When it reached the porch, the air completely changed. It stopped right outside the front door, and the silence that followed was louder than any sound. It was the absence of sound. No cricket, no wind in the pines. Nothing. Just a vacuum of noise. Then came the worst part. It didn't bang on the door or try to break in. Instead, I heard something press up against the wood. The sound of heavy flesh and coarse hair rubbing slowly against the dry timber. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, the texture of the sound vibrating the thin door frame. And then, that massive, slow inhalation sound came again, right there, inches from the door. But this time, it was followed by the most chilling thing I've ever experienced. It was a silent scream. I know that sounds contradictory, but that's the only way to describe it. It was a sound that didn't use volume, but pure intensity. It felt like a physical pressure building up, and then releasing. A huge internal shout that vibrated through the floorboards and into my chest. It wasn't a roar. It was a noise of sheer, overwhelming frustration or rage, controlled and contained, but still powerful enough to make my ears ring. After that silent shout, the air was still again. I waited. After a minute, I heard the thump-drag steps retreat from the porch. They moved away into the darkness, slowly, until the sound was swallowed by the deep woods. I didn't move until the first sliver of grey light came through the window around 6 a.m. I packed up my truck 15 minutes later, leaving everything neat, but skipping the coffee. I haven't been back to that rental since. The chill of the autumn morning bit right through my thermals, but I wasn't complaining. Perched on that rocky outcrop overlooking the Mogollon Rim, I had the perfect view. The sun was just starting to paint the sky, and the air was so still you could hear a pine needle drop. I'd been out here since before dawn, waiting. Not just for any deer, but a specific buck I'd been tracking for weeks. A monster with a rack like a crown. Suddenly, a blur of brown exploded into my field of vision. A deer, a young buck by the looks of it, was tearing through the underbrush below me. Not just running, but fleeing. Its eyes were wide with a terror I'd rarely seen in an animal that wasn't actively being chased by a predator. It was pure, unadulterated panic, like it was running from the devil himself. My hunter's instinct kicked in, but before I could even move, the deer was gone, swallowed by the dense junipers on the other side of the ravine. I lowered my gear, my heart thudding. What in the world could make a deer run like that? There were no coyotes, no mountain lions I could see. The air was still. Too still, now that I thought about it. A shiver, colder than the morning air, traced its way up my spine. And then I saw it. Movement in the junipers, right where the deer had disappeared. At first, I thought it might be another deer, maybe the one I was after. But something was off. It was moving upright, tall, wider than any man I'd ever seen, with shoulders that seemed to dwarf the dense brush it was pushing through. And silent, unnaturally silent. Junipers are notoriously noisy, their branches snapping and rustling with the slightest disturbance, but this thing moved through them like smoke. I froze, every fibre of my being screaming at me to react. But I couldn't. My hands were shaking, and a primal fear I hadn't felt since I was a kid lost in a cave gripped me. It was dark, a deep earthy brown, almost black, and its silhouette was ragged like a massive shaggy fur coat. It moved with a fluid, powerful grace, each step deliberate, purposeful. It never looked at me, not once, but I swear, with every fibre of my being, that it knew exactly where I was. It was like it was actively avoiding my gaze, yet its presence, its sheer awareness, was palpable. It wasn't fast, not like the deer, but it was relentless. It covered ground with an easy stride that spoke of immense power and endurance. My mind, usually so sharp in the woods, was a jumble of disbelief and terror. A bear? No. Too tall, too human-like in its gait. A man? Not possible. No man could move like that, or be that big, or be that silent. The sun had climbed a little higher now, casting long shadows, but also illuminating glimpses of it through the trees. A glimpse of something massive, something ancient, something that didn't belong. It disappeared over the ridge, just as silently as it had appeared. The junipers settled, the forest returned to its unnatural quiet, and the only sound was the frantic pounding of my own heart. I stayed there for a long time, gear still across my lap, staring at the spot where it had vanished. My hands were still shaking. My whole body was. I've hunted these woods my entire life. I've seen mountain lions, bears, coyotes, bobcats. I've heard the whispers of the Mogollon Monster, dismissed them as campfire tales, legends for tourists. But what I saw that morning, the sheer, raw terror of that deer, and the silent, imposing presence that followed it, it wasn't a legend, it was real, and it was here. I packed up my gear, my hunting trip cut short. The thought of that buck, the one with the crown, was long gone. All I could think about was the silhouette, the silent movement, the undeniable feeling of being watched, even when it wasn't looking. I haven't been back to that spot since, and I don't think I ever will. I was out last fall doing survey work in the Tonto National Forest, way up past Payson, near one of the deep creeks where the old mining claims used to be. It was my third day solo, just me and a GPS unit, checking boundary markers for an environmental impact report. I'd hiked maybe 5 miles off the service road when I came across this abandoned Forest Service cabin. It wasn't on any of my maps, just a small single-room structure, leaning a bit, but mostly intact. Looked like it had been empty since the late 70s. I decided to stop there for lunch. The creek ran right behind it, and there was a decent clearing. I sat down on a rotting porch step and was halfway through a cold sandwich when I heard the water stop flowing. Now, this creek wasn't huge, maybe 6 feet wide, but it had a steady, healthy flow. To suddenly hear nothing but the air was immediate and weird. I stood up, walked around the side of the cabin, and looked upstream. About 50 yards up, where the creek makes a tight bend around a cluster of big pines, there was something in the water. It was big, maybe 7 feet tall, standing fully upright right in the middle of the channel. The water was only up to its knees, but the thing was broad, massive, and covered in matted, dark hair. It was hunched over, kind of leaning forward, and it had its arms submerged. I froze. I'm a big guy, 6'3", but this thing looked like it weighed 3 times what I did. It wasn't a bear. It was shaped like a man, but wider, thicker through the torso, and the way it stood was unnervingly human. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched it. It kept messing with the water, and I realized what it was doing. It was dredging the creek bed. I could see it scooping up mud, rocks, and debris, a huge double handful at a time, and tossing the material onto the bank. It was clearing a path, or maybe building a small dam, but the purpose and the action was what got me. It was deliberate, powerful work. As I watched, it stood up straight, turning its head slightly towards the bank where I was hidden behind the cabin corner. I didn't see its face clearly, just the dark mass of its head and shoulders. I felt an immediate, primal fear, the kind that locks your muscles up. It wasn't angry. It just felt aware, like a mountain noticing a pebble. After a few more seconds, it let out a low, guttural noise. It wasn't a roar or a howl. It was more like a deep, wet cough or a warning. Then it stepped out of the water, its huge feet splashing onto the muddy bank, and just walked into the dense thicket on the far side of the creek. It didn't rush. It just left. The second it was gone, the sound came back, the rush of the creek water flowing freely again. I didn't finish my sandwich. I backed away slowly, made a wide loop around the cabin, and practically ran the 5 miles back to the service road. I never told my supervisor what I saw. Just marked the boundary points and filed the report. I still work out there, but I don't stop near the water anymore.